Okay, we're back for APS Stamp Chat. I'm Scott English, Executive Director of the American Philatelic Society. Joining me is Dr. Shirley Mueller, board certified in neurology and psychiatry. Dr. Mueller is internationally recognized as a lecturer and author in neuropsychology and as a collector and scholar of Chinese export porcelain. She is an adjunct professor in the Department of Neurology at Indiana University. Stamp Chats are made possible through the support of APS members. To learn more about APS membership, please visit our website at stamps.org. For those watching live, your microphone and camera are disabled during the presentation. You can use the chat section to share with fellow attendees. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll get to all of your questions following the presentation. If you miss any of this presentation, the session is recorded and will be posted on the APS YouTube page. For tonight's talk, approximately 1/3 of the population enjoys collecting objects, which provides intellectual stimulation, the thrill of the chase, and the opportunity to leave a legacy. However, the same pursuit can also cause pain, such as paying too much for an object, unknowingly buying a fake, or dealing with the frustrations of collection dispersal. Until recently, there was no objective way to enhance the positive aspects of collecting and minimize the negative ones. Scientific research in neuro and behavioral economics allows us to turn this around. Using examples from these disciplines, Dr. Mueller relates her own experiences as a serious collector and neuroscientist to examine different behavioral traits that form the basis of collecting. Whether you're a collector, love a collector, or are thinking of becoming a collector, this talk will help you better understand your collecting and hopefully make it an even better experience. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shirley Mueller.
Thank you, Scott. So first of all, it is an honor to be here and to be invited by you. I'm thrilled. Even though I collect something different than stamps, I hope that, or I know that what I have to say today will be applicable to everyone in the audience. And this is because we're all basically the same. Our neurobiology is all hardwired 98, 99+% the same. So collecting choices not only apply in terms of neuroscience to those decisions that are made, but also to life's decisions as well. Scott was telling me about this wonderful 1-cent magenta stamp from New Guinea. And I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but I can only say it not only sounds fabulous, but looks fabulous. I'm lucky all of you, although I'm sure only one person holds it. At any rate, let's see here. Let's see if I can. Having a little trouble progressing my slides. There we go. Okay. I collect antique Chinese export porcelain. This is porcelain that is made in the East and exported to the West. Different than stamps, obviously, but as I said, the same principles apply. Other recent collectors interested in why collectors collect include Sigmund Freud, who collected Greek vases. In fact, he kept them on his desk when he would see patients for psychoanalysis. And Werner Münsterberger, who became well known through writing on the subject. In fact, Münsterberger lived on the Upper East Side, which is in Manhattan, which is where I am tonight. And he was a psychoanalyst who saw patients as notable as James Dean. He was the rich and special person psychoanalyst. He wrote about collecting. He had a number of collectors as patients. But he collected, just as Freud did, something out of the usual. He collected African maps. Now, it would appear that the three of us have a lot in common. That would be Freud, Münsterberger, and myself, and fourthly, all of you. But there are major differences between Freud, Münsterberger, and us that open up my presentation today. First, let's talk about the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. He lived between 1856 and 1939, so around the turn of the century, around the turn of 1900. Now, when he studied collecting, he came to the conclusion, based upon what he surmised from what people told him, and also what he thought in his mind, because he didn't have any real scientific methods to use. But he determined collecting as a redirection of surplus libido onto an inanimate object. Now, I don't know what you think about this, but I thought it didn't really apply to me, and I had observed a lot of other collectors who I thought it didn't apply to as well. This is in spite of the fact that Sigmund Freud collected Greek vases, so it seems like such a dichotomy, giving himself away like that. But at any rate, as if Freud wasn't disparaging enough about collectors, then comes along Werner Münsterberger. He lived 1930 to 2011. He wrote his book in 1994 called Collecting: An Unruly Passion. And in it, he wrote a string of unflattering statements about collectors, one of which we see here. They like to pose to make a spectacle of their possessions. And while they use their objects for inner security and outer applause, their deep inner function is to screen off doubts and unassimilated memories. These less than positive comments about collectors, which include us, made me want to examine why I collect. I did not feel that I was sublimating my libido onto inanimate objects, as Freud had suggested, nor did I perceive that I had been deprived or depraved in childhood, as Münsterberger indicated. In fact, I felt collecting made me happy and enriched my life. In many ways, it was the joy of my life because, we go and we work 40, 60, 80 hours a week. And then what do we have for recreation? Collecting gives us another purpose beyond our regular jobs. And so it's not really just a hobby, it's a passion. Curiosity about my own experience led me to explore why I felt like I did, that collecting gave me joy. As a physician trained in neurology and psychiatry, I had been educated to ask questions. Fortunately, in the early 1990s, when I started this journey, answers were beginning to become accessible due to new scientific discoveries not available to Freud and Münsterberger. These revolutionary discoveries made it evident that the prevailing ideas of why collectors collect was due to be revised. Now, the interesting thing to me is that even though we have this new science today, and it is well known as to why humans, at least some of the time, do what they do in terms of seeking joy for themselves, there are still many people who think that collecting is because there was a problem in childhood. I hope that we can disparage that idea today. So rather than the convoluted theories of Freud and Münsterberger, I believe the drive to collect is rooted in our neurobiology, that we actually have neurons, pathways, and so on that drive us to do what we do. This new understanding was a motivation for my recent book, Inside the Head of a Collector: Neuropsychological Forces at Play. Essentially, I wanted to share what I felt I had found with other collectors to help them realize that they weren't such bad people after all, but good people. So in it, I look at the feelings of pleasure and pain regarding collecting, which can easily be broadened to life experiences. Since I collect Chinese export porcelain, an intact piece shown on the left is obviously gives me pleasure. On the other hand, if it's broken, I don't feel comfortable at all. In fact, it's like cutting off an arm or a leg. It hurts so much. This damage, in fact, that you see here took place in an earthquake earthquake in Indianapolis, where I live most of the time. And we don't get many earthquakes, but we did get, I think it was a 5 or a 7 on the scale of earthquakes. And the cabinet shook that this particular porcelain was in, and the porcelain came forward. I couldn't open the door without it falling out, even though putting towels and so on under it was what I tried. So eventually, the only way to get it out was to allow it to break. Actually, it was broken before I even got it out. The two disciplines addressed in my book are neuroeconomics, shown on the left, which is the study of economic thought, of which collecting is a subset, and behavioral economics, which is incorporation of insights from psychology and other social sciences in the study of economic behavior, including collecting. Understanding these disciplines mean we can not only make better collecting decisions, but as I said previously, life choices as well. Lastly, the third part of my book includes collector experiences, of which there are many, as you know. We all remember where we purchased something, how much it cost, the interaction with the dealer, or what happened at the auction house, whether it was in-person auction or over the phone or via Zoom. But these experiences are so important to us. They're part of our life. And so we all have stories about them, which enrich our lives. Due to time limitations, only one will be covered today. Essentialism. More about that later. Essentialism is important, incidentally, in terms of whether something is fake or not. None of us want to buy a fake. And once we have it, I know porcelain collectors that once they have a fake, they're so embarrassed that they won't even put it on the market again as a fake. And of course, no museum will take it if that museum knows it's a fake. At any rate, now to explore why collecting gives pleasure, we're going to take an armchair trip. Now just imagine this trip with me, and there's a point in this trip, which you will see later, but I was with a group in Amsterdam. It was from the Peabody Essex Museum, and we just took a short 12-mile journey to Haarlem, Holland. And the reason was because Haarlem had the Frans Hals Museum, which of course contains many paintings by Frans Hals. Haarlem is a medieval city, the home of the famous painter, as I said, Frans Hals. Hals had paintings, let's see, throughout the museum, and we see one here above a table set very similar to the table in the painting. I was thrilled to be in the Frans Hals Museum, and I was very happy to be with my particular group, very cordial group. But I knew this was a medieval city, and I thought maybe I can find a special piece of porcelain here that no one else will be able to identify. And I'm sure all of you have experienced this with me. You know, you think you have it. You think you can find something. You're on the chase. There couldn't be a better thrill in the world. So I exited the museum and I took a left, another left, and then a right. I encountered 2 antique shops in my journey, but neither of them had anything of interest. The third antique shop, again, I didn't see one single thing. However, the owner and this particular man you see here, and this is from a photograph 12 years later when I went to visit him again. Van Newt is his name. We struck up a conversation casually about Chinese porcelain. He was in the back and he was photographing some sort of maybe not very second-rate porcelain with a photographer that he was going to place ads in a magazine. So anyway, we talked 5 minutes or so. And at the end of this 5 or 7 minutes, this stocky Dutchman turned to me. Remember, first time we ever met, and he said, "Would you like to see my private collection?" Well, I didn't know if I wanted to see his private collection. So like many people, I asked him where it was. And I knew I had to do it fast because my group was leaving at a certain time. And I wanted, if it was going to happen that I was going to see his private collection, I wanted to get it over with. So he said, "Well, it's right up there." We were in the house by that time, his shop. And I thought, oh my goodness, nobody knows where I am. And it was before cell phones. And should I do this? Well, this was some years ago when I was considerably younger, as was he. Anyway, you have to make a decision. And conflicting thoughts were running through my mind. And this brings out what Daniel Kahneman said in Thinking Fast and Slow. Humans are to thinking as cats are to swimming. We can do it when we have to, but we much prefer not to. Now, I'm not going to tell you what happened that day right now, but we're going to return to it later. We all want to think decisions are made with our rational brain, which is the top of our brain, the neocortex, our newly developed brain. Instead, however, we know now since the late 90s, 2000s, that there are emotions that are bubbling up from the middle part of our brain called the limbic system. Note the emotions here. And that area, the very deep part of our brain under the neocortex, is on top of the reptilian brain. So we have 3 parts to our brain. We have a non-thinking reptilian brain, we have an emotional brain, the middle brain, which developed next, and above it we have our executive brain or neocortex. So we all think, most of us have thought until perhaps recently, that when we make decisions, we're using our neocortex, our newly developed brain. So let's look at the 3 parts of the brain that I just talked about in a little more detail. The nucleus accumbens is the pleasure part of the brain. The insula is price concerns. And this is all within the deep part of the brain. And the amygdala is a fear center. So when we ever, I'm condensing this because there are many other connections and so on in this part of the brain, the middle part of the brain, the limbic system. But these are very major in what we know the most about. So let's look at examples of what happens. So we can tell what happens within the brain due to the study of neuroeconomics, and that's the biologic study of the brain. And here you see a patient in an MRI machine, which many of you have already experienced, magnetic resonance imaging. And magnetic resonance imaging has to do with magnets that determine essentially structure in the brain. However, now we can not only determine structure with MRI, but there's something called fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And this is more sophisticated than the plain MRI, which just determines structure. It can actually tell function from moment to moment. This, of course, requires a great deal of machinery. At any rate, here I illustrate what might happen in the brain in someone who views a flower. This is the flower, and this is the brain. I'm going to move this. I don't know if it's within your vision or not. But anyway, the flower registers in the visual cortex, the vision cortex in the back of the brain. And the activity is shown in yellow here. And in front of it is the memory area of the brain. So we have those two areas of the brain that are working. The underlying process is this. So when your brain is at rest and is not seeing anything that stimulates you in any way, we have, of course, blood flow to the neurons. But let's say that you see the flower or you see a stamp, better yet, that you like, then the neurons in the vision area and in the memory area become activated. And when these neurons become activated, they require more oxygen. Think of going to the gym. Think of lifting weights with your bicep. You obviously need oxygen for it. So the blood vessels increase in diameter and supply that oxygen so your muscle can do what you're asking it to do. So what we see with the flower or the stamp causes the need for oxygen to the neurons that are involved in the activity of seeing it. So example, when we perceive chocolate cake, which most of us like, our nucleus accumbens, the pleasure center is activated. Now notice here that it is deep within the brain. This is the cortex up here, the thinking part of the brain. And this is the limbic system here, deep within the brain. So for the first time, scientists can tell what is happening moment to moment in the center of the brain, the limbic system, where before it was only on the top of the brain, the neocortex, like EEG monitoring for those of you who have had brainwave tests, EEG. In addition to, well, this shows what would happen to me if I saw this piece of porcelain. My pleasure center would light up. And in fact, it did when I saw that piece of porcelain. It's like you don't want something, you need something. And when I saw that piece right there, I didn't just want it, I needed it. So that's what happens to you when you see a choice stamp. You don't just want it, you need it badly. But if you need it, there are other factors, opposing factors to just wanting it. One is the insula, which is price concerns, indicates price concerns, and you have to take that into account. For example, if you and your family are short on money, you might want to think about buying something that you think you need. There are lots of factors. If you think, for example, you're being cheated, the insula might light up. This yellow indicates lighting up. And notice again, the insula is deep within the brain. It's not in the cortex of the brain. Another factor when we make decisions is fear. So I can give you an example of this. I was in London one time, and there was a dealer was offering a set of porcelain that was too good to be true, and at a price that just couldn't possibly be. It looked perfect, and he had a good story. But when I checked it with some specialists, it had been around a bit, and it was known to be the whole set was a fake. And the dealer didn't even know it was a fake. This happens sometimes, I think, to all of us, that the dealers actually, in good faith, are offering something that is not what it is portrayed to be. So the onus is always on us to determine whether something is what the dealer says it is, or even the auction house says what it is. So anyway, The fear center is here again, deep within the brain. You see it lighting up, and the red indicates, or the yellow indicates the most intensity of all. You see the scale down here. So when we make decisions, the executive brain. Yes, I want to emphasize that. Again, the executive brain in the front of the brain in the neocortex, what you see. A Harvard professor has indicated that 95% of decisions are subconscious. And so, though we think that our decisions are being made by our neocortex and executive brain, this Gerald Altman is saying that most of our decisions are subconscious. Whether it's 95% or 90% or 89% or 85%, I don't think it matters. The whole point is that our emotions are bubbling up toward the surface of the brain to take major control of our decisions. And this happens because we're often tired when we make decisions, so we don't want to think. There might be conflicting thoughts in our mind. So we just take the easiest route out, essentially, the easiest way that we can. Now let's talk about decision making for a moment. The same decisions that you make and I make when we buy anything, including stamps, including porcelain. So we can think of it as a teeter-totter. And for a while, I think in decision making, this helps. This diagram helps. It certainly did for me. So desire is on the left side of the teeter-totter, and price concerns and fear are on the other side of the teeter-totter. There are also many other factors, emotions, of which we know fewer. And eventually we will, but not at the present time. So if desire is the only factor, there are no price concerns, or there's no fear or other factors bubbling up from deep within the brain, then we buy. It's easy. But it isn't, most of the time, it isn't that clear, unfortunately. And most of the time, there are other factors. And in this case, I made it kind of simple, where here we do have price concerns and fear of deceit, so we don't buy. So in thinking of a decision, think of I want it, I need it, and then on the other side, think, can I afford it? How important is it to me to own this so that my ego is somehow affected positively? Or I guess another way to think about it is intellectually. I think a lot of us like anything we collect because there's an intellectual factor. And that can be so potent, just like any of the other 20, 30 factors that are recognized in terms of collecting. Now we're going to go on to the next area, which is behavioral economics. So we covered neuroeconomics and how it came about and the importance of it when we make decisions, the biologic importance. Now we're going to talk about behavioral economics. And this is social science, and Daniel Kahneman, for example, would be a good example of a scientist who studied behavioral economics, why people do what they do. So this is kind of the other side of how we make decisions, neuroeconomics and behavioral economics. We're just going to cover three of the major factors in behavioral economics: anchoring, unfairness, and sunk cost. Anchoring. Now, it's a positive or a cognitive process during which individuals fixate on a target that may or may not be accurate. For example, if we go to shop and we see a similar article, one to the other, that is 300 marked down from 1,000, or the other is just 300, not marked down, we're much more likely to take the 300. And the reason is because we believe we're getting a bargain. We were anchored by this 1,000, which might not even be the true original value of it. It just might be put on a tag for our benefit for the day. This is a really great example, the Campbell soup. So this was studied very thoroughly by some important investigators. And what they did was, it's just ingenious. They put a discounted price on Campbell's soup in a store, and they put limit 12 per customer. Then the average customer bought 7 cans. What happened when they didn't put a limit on it, an anchor? Well, same discounted price, no limit, no anchor. Customers bought an average 3.3 cans per shopper. Because they didn't have that anchor in their mind, they actually bought fewer cans of Campbell's soup. Our next behavioral economics factor that we're going to talk about is unfairness. And this refers to our social preference for equitable outcomes. When we buy, we want to pay a fair price for the object. And when we sell, we want to glean a fair price for the object we sold. It's only human nature, for most humans at least. Most of us are not scam artists and so on. So let's go over what's called the ultimatum game. And this demonstrates this fairness beautifully. Player number 1 is given money to share. This is player number 1. So the first player, this number 1 right here, can keep the money if the second player accepts the first player's offer. So the first player has to decide how much he or she can give the second player, and the second player will accept. This is what happened in the game. If less than 25% of the original money is offered, and the second player knows how much the first player was given, the second player rejects the offer 50% of the time. But if 30% or more is offered, the second player accepts most of the time. And then they both gain because they can both keep the money. In this instant, where less than 25% of the money was offered, if the second player rejects the offer, as they do here, at least half of the time, then neither of them get any money. So this demonstrates that there is a sense of fairness, that the second player wants to be treated fairly and will reject any money that he or she is given. Let's say the first player offers 10%. Well, the second player, because he or she thinks it's unfair, doesn't accept it. Now, what's interesting is that this is even demonstrated in the animal kingdom. And we're going to look at capuchin monkeys, which you see here. So you see a capuchin monkey on the left, and you see a capuchin monkey on the right. They can see each other. They know what's happening to the other monkey. And they're playing a game that they're very familiar with the researcher, which is that the monkey gives the researcher a rock, and then she gives them a grape. And you're going to see this here in just a moment. Okay, you see, here's the grapes, and here are cucumbers. So I'm just going to tell you what's going to happen, just because it's sometimes it's easy to miss. But anyway, the grapes, which the monkeys prefer, are given only to this monkey. This monkey, in exchange for a rock, is given cucumber. Oh my goodness. Let's go on. Not only does this monkey take the cage, but she also throws it back, clearly. So I think we can see that even in the animal kingdom, that the sense of fairness is present. And the capuchin monkeys obviously had it in spades. The last behavioral economics tenet that we're going to talk about is sunk cost. Now remember, there are many, many more of these, but we're just selecting a few because of time limitations and probably interest too. But this is really important in regular life, sunk cost. And it's the tendency of people to irrationally follow through on an activity that is not meeting their expectations because of the time, effort, and or money they already spent on it. We all do this, and it is such a waste of previous effort, time, and money when we continue in a pursuit that is not getting us anywhere at all. So one example of this, an easy one to understand, is staying in a movie we don't like or enjoy because we paid for it. So we may be online, buy the ticket to the movie. Post-COVID, we take our whole family to the movie. It could be any movie. I'm just using this particular movie, The Joker, as an example. We find out, we buy popcorn, we sit down, we're looking forward to an evening with those that we love. And after 20 minutes, we see that it's not our kind of movie. All of us are kind of saying, well, do we really want to stay? What happens most of the time? The family stays. Why? Because they didn't want to waste their money, time, or effort prior to the time that they decide that all of these outlays are not working to their benefit. So essentially, we want to do that, of course, in collecting too, not to waste our time. I could give you some examples from my own behavior in an auction once where I didn't get what I wanted. It just went way too high. And I was just, so unraveled by this that I bought another piece in the auction later that I didn't want. And as it turns out, really nobody else wants it either. So good lesson for me anyway. Sunk cost. Now, the third part of my book is collector experiences. And I like to talk about essentialism because I think it's so important in everything we do, and especially in collecting, because nobody likes to buy a fake. And yet, occasionally, a lot of people will buy fakes. So why is it that we don't like to buy fakes? Well, let's take a look at this. For me, the left part of this plate is authentic and the right part is not. Some hints would be the silver here, which is just plain black or lead here. The border, blue, orange here, orange and flowered here, colored flowers. even the internal border is different, left on right. Now, this plate, the whole plate on the left, was a 1740 plate, so it's worth a fair amount of money. This on the right is something I bought on eBay just to show that it was being duplicated, poorly duplicated, but still duplicated. So I bought the eBay plate made recently in China for a reason, to show this. But what if I had purchased it and I didn't know? Well, that would be because probably I hadn't seen enough of the real thing. At any rate, so essentialism, we find occurs because what we believe influences our responses. So let's say that we go to a wine tasting, which can be very, very pleasurable. And we are told in one round of wine that this wine is rated very highly, and it's rated a 10. And do we like it? Yes. Our pleasure center up here in the front of our brain lights up. What if we are told the wine rates like a 1 or 2? It's not a particularly good wine. Well, our pleasure center doesn't line up. This has actually been done in functional magnetic resonance imaging. Some of you may know about it. So the researchers kind of played a trick on the subjects in that the wine was the same for both. So the idea is, and the conclusion was, that what we think something is heavily influences us. Now there's another area that we know in neurology called Capgras syndrome. And this is a syndrome where the patient thinks that the loved one isn't who he or she says she is. So what happens here? Well, here it isn't that we're told something externally, it's that our internal wiring is wrong. So here is the patient with the problem, which can be due to a number of things. It can be due to head trauma, it can be due to dementia, it can be due to schizophrenia. At any rate, the patient sees a loved one, like a mother, for example. And actually, I'm doing normal, I'm sorry, this is not the patient. A normal person sees a loved one and recognizes a loved one with the visual cortex, and emotional recognition tells them it is the correct person. But in cases with pathology, which is, I just said, the head trauma, for example, Alzheimer's, Lewy body, schizophrenia, the patient with these diseases thinks that the mother, father is not who she or he says she is because the emotional regulation has changed. Interestingly enough, in schizophrenia, when treated, this disorder will reverse. So we know it's chemical, we know it's within the brain, that the wiring is somehow changed, and that with treatment, at least in schizophrenia, it can be altered back toward normal. So what we have here is what we see is heavily experienced by our beliefs. It can be biased by external forces, that's what we're told, or by internal forces, which is our brain chemistry and connections. So when we see a piece of art or a stamp, we are influenced by what the dealer tells us, or by even internal emotions, such as how we feel that day. Is the sun shining? Did someone just say something nasty to us? All that can influence how we feel about a piece. Now, we're going to go back to Harlem and what happened when, what decision did I make? Well, essentially, I just decided it's the thrill of the chase. I'm going up that stairs and I'm going to see what this man has. And that I did. And at the top of the stairs, it was just a beautiful Dutch setting in which everything was neat as a pin. And in the back was a cupboard. And in that cupboard, he had his prize porcelain, his best pieces. And what was in the cupboard? Well, these two pieces were there. I'd never seen them before. I didn't even know if they were what I thought they were because they were so new and unusual to me. In fact, my novelty center was titillated, as yours is when you see a stamp you've never seen before and you suspect that it's genuine, but you're not sure. So let's talk about the novelty center. The novelty center is within the brain. It's been identified where it is, and how did anybody even come upon an experiment to find out where it is? Well, this would be such an experiment. It's called the oddball experiment, where a subject is in a functional magnetic resonance imaging, and let's say subjects with Adidas hats flash before the subject 20, 30 times. And then someone wearing a different kind of hat, as an affinity hat, comes up. And then the subject presses a lever, and the functional magnetic resonance imaging is detected at that point when the subject has recognized something different. And the parts of the brain light up at that time when the subject's novelty center is stimulated, are the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area. Now, not only are these two areas lit up, in fact, they have many connections to the pleasure center, dopaminergic connections, but also there's even a dose response curve. So the greater the novelty, the more intense the response, which is pretty exciting. So we all respond to novelty. We all want that New Guinea stamp. It's novel. Of course, we aren't going to get it, but we love it. So why was the novelty center, how did it come about? Because the novelty center can lead to additional rewards, and if those who are exposed to novelty act on it. For example, among our predecessors, those who saw something as a novelty and pursued it, if it turned out, then they were ahead of the others in their group and so on. So it can have a very beneficial effect, novelty. So this is what I saw at the top of the stairs. My novelty center was very much stimulated. I bought these after making a deal with the dealer. He said, you know, I want them to go to a good home, and that usually means theoretically that he's bargaining. The price was not so high that I couldn't afford it, and if I had to, I could even make a mistake. I didn't know if I was, but I thought I wasn't. So anyway, they arrived in Indianapolis and they were placed on shelves just like this. And our cat Ernie would actually jump up to them and would walk around them. He walked around the outside and he never swung his tail because he seemed to realize that these pieces were very important. So he did that. It was about 6 months or so, but then a publication arrived in the mail, and it was called the Oriental Ceramic Society Newsletter. And you see this piece here. It looks very much like the porcelains that I had purchased. And you can see it in a close-up here. It is like one of the two pieces that I purchased. And this is Europa holding such peace in her outstretched left arm. And this was painted on the ceiling of the Oranienburg Palace, north of Berlin, in 1697 by a person called August Terreston. And when I saw this, I knew I had something special. You see here the tea leaves, they're upside down on the pieces, but they are tea leaves. Chrysanthemums above, the tea leaf comes from the chrysanthemum plant. You see it's white on blue on the right and blue on white on the left. And this would suggest that one of these canisters was for black tea and the other one was for green tea. You see here in an engraving in 1700, the family is having tea, a Dutch family. You see here is a kettle full of water for the tea, and here's a teapot. And above the gentleman's hat, you see a canister that looks very similar to the one that I purchased in Harlem that day. So that made me very, very happy that I had something that was authenticated in this way. So essentially, what does the science of collecting tell us? It stimulates our pleasure center, which enhances our quality of life. Still, our collecting decisions involve a struggle between our emotions and logic. By understanding this, we can not only increase pleasure and diminish pain, we can also make better life decisions in general. So I'm so excited that you are collectors yourself, and I am so looking forward to some questions from you. The photographs, or most of them in the book, were by my husband, Thomas Mueller, who is a photographer. So I hope that you get a chance to read some of the other vignettes in the book, which of which there are many. I think we're ready for questions.
We're going to start with one of my favorite topics. We received a question that I was going to ask anyway, and it starts with, is there a collector gene? If not, can you inherit collecting interests?
That is so interesting, and what a good question. Well, okay, first of all, we don't know whether it's a collecting gene, but we do know that it seems that there's some predisposition to it. Of course, collecting has to do with not only genetics, but also environment, experiences, even probably nostalgia to some degree. But I've talked with so many collectors who can actually pinpoint the very moment when they became interested in collecting, and not only collecting, but a particular area of collecting, whether it would be a father or an uncle or an aunt, whatever. I myself know I don't know the exact moment, but I know generally why I started collecting. And everybody in the audience, if you think about it, you probably can pinpoint a reason. It just takes a little bit of diving deep inside.
When I speak to audiences, I often challenge the assumption that there's a collector gene because I feel like it's manifesting a hunter-gatherer instinct that we all have anyway, and it's just a different way of realizing it versus some other things that you could do. But I get pushback on a regular basis because there are people who are fully convinced that there is in fact a collector gene. So I think you were helpful in that. In terms of what you collect and taking it to the next step, in terms of what you collect, how do you think that gets influenced?
By experiences, by meeting other collectors, which is wonderful. Of course, your group is fabulous in that you can interact with one another and enjoy one another. That's one of the major benefits of collecting, is that there's camaraderie and there's a group. However, the group can get a little competitive, as you know. And I did a lot of interviews for my book, and I understand from one dealer that he actually bid up a price and there was another dealer who said something very unkind to him about that he got the piece and the other dealer didn't. So I think there is competitiveness and nastiness occasionally in the field, but that is to be expected, I think, in any area. Most of the time, it's a very gentlemanly, gentlewomanly activity. So it satisfies intellectual curiosity, it satisfies social needs, and so on.
Yeah, I've been interested in hearing your perspective as a collector of non-stamps, that the parallels are incredibly strong, that it seems to transcend whatever collecting you're in, that you see the same behaviors manifest themselves. So it's very interesting to hear about that.
I'm going to say I read a couple pieces about collectors of music or vinyl. I interviewed someone in New York, and then that was kind of the springboard for it. And essentially, then I reviewed all the literature for collectors of vinyl and found that they're really the same as collectors of porcelain or probably collectors of stamps. In terms of personality inventories, we collectors in general score very high on openness. That means that they are willing to look into new experiences, and also on conscientiousness, as you can imagine, because we have to be very careful when we collect. In fact, a lot of collectors love the rigor of it, which is something that we can do as a passion outside of any kind of work.
We have another question from one of the attendees. It says, you've cited a number of studies and it seems like you apply them to collectors in collecting by analogy. Have psychological or neurological studies actually been done on collectors themselves rather than, say, on capuchin monkeys?
No, that's a good question. I'm sorry. Can you hear that? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's ringing stuff. I'm so sorry. At any rate, I think that this person who is attending the seminar is quite right. We do know personality studies specifically about collectors. So we do know that. In terms of analogies, I think it's fair definitely to make the analogies. I think one of the problems is in terms of doing fMRI on collectors, which have been done. Well, I can tell you one that's really interesting, but it's expensive. And to take collectors for like if we took stamp collectors and compared their brains when they light up, having to do with stamps, compared to porcelain collectors when their brains light up having to do with porcelain, it would be an enormously ambitious undertaking that very well, like the National Institute of Health is just not going to support it because it would be considered superfluous. But I would like to tell you about one study that is enormously interesting, and that was done by Anderson in the University of Iowa and several other researchers. And they looked at people who developed collecting proclivities after brain surgery. And they found that those people had changes in certain parts of the brain after brain surgery. So the idea would be that there does seem to be a particular part of the brain that lends itself to collecting. So yes, there have been actually lots of studies on personality, and this one particular study that was aimed at collecting proclivities that developed after surgery. And I think, another area where there have been studies is in hoarding, although only 2 to 3% of collectors are hoarders. But a number of studies have been done on hoarders because it's such an interesting, evidently, field to most people. And people read about it, but they've shown like differences in glucose metabolism in the brain and so on. And to my knowledge, nothing is really conclusive there. I do think hoarding is a neurologic problem. It can't be helped by the person that does it. It's just very sad for that person.
Yeah, there was a question actually where, does collecting eventually evolve into hoarding for some people who go to, say, the extreme in their hobby? Is there a connection between those two things?
I would say so. I would say that some collectors do become hoarders. Very few. For most, it doesn't lead that way at all. I'm trying to think about hoarders for just a moment. Do you jump off and are you a hoarder right away, or do you start as a collector? It would seem you have to start as a collector because it takes a while to gather so many pieces. But there's a major difference between collectors and hoarders, and that is that collectors enjoy their collection, hoarders do not. Hoarders generally collect extremely minor objects like paper clips or articles of clothing or anything that anyone discards, so it's generally of little to no value. Collectors like to collect high-end things as expensive as they can. So here, observation in general is that they have propensity for what? I don't know. Something popped up on my screen.
Oh, there's a response. This is one of my observations about stamp collectors in general, is that they have a propensity for organizing and an interest in history. How
Yes,
does this? And then the question breaks off.
right. Oh, well, I would agree with that. I remember I said conscientiousness comes up as one of the traits of a collector, and many collectors have an interest in many collectors of porcelain have an interest in history. And in fact, that's what sparked me um, in terms of collecting Chinese porcelain, because I was very interested in the Chinese people. And when I was in high school, I saw in a I think it's Six Happiness, and thought I would be Ingrid Bergman, and I'd go to China, and she led Chinese children away from the invading Japanese. And I thought, I'm going to do something special like that myself. But after you go to medical school and you get married and you have a child, it sort of becomes less possible, especially with Mao Zedong. So I just did sublimate like Freud said. And I, I guess it was a sublimation because I got into all things Chinese, including porcelain. And I've been to China 5 times, talked actually at the invitation of the government to Chinese audiences twice. And, I guess you could say that I did go to China, but in a different way.
Uh, the next question is recently retired pediatric neuropsychologist asked this question. Are there any studies which suggest that certain psychiatric diagnosis, he mentions ADHD specifically, predisposes the person to collecting? I mentioned ADHD in particular due to the dopaminergic neurons in the prefrontal cortex. I think you understand that better than I did.
That is an interesting idea, but to my knowledge, no. And well, I mean, I know this pediatric neurologist knows, for example, that collecting can be pharmacologically induced in some Parkinson's patients, depending on the drugs they're on. But they're adults, they're not kids. But that's all I know about that subject. Very interesting.
Are you aware of any studies regarding collecting and neurodivergence?
What is neurodivergence? Oh, I know what it is. I'm sorry. Yes, I know what it is. Not to my knowledge. I
Good
mean,
answer.
yeah, does right.
Are there other aspects that give satisfaction, such as imposing order by ordering items in a particular way or getting a sense of completion?
Yes. Oh, yes. The completion is so important. It's has there was a paper about this, and it has a neuroeconomics evidently underlying reason, which is that sets are more valuable than a single. For example, if I collected glassware and I had 8 glasses that were alike, it would increase the value of this kind of glass tremendously. And even in Chinese porcelain, the sets, the garnitures, they're sets of 3, 5, 7, or 9. If someone has an original set of 3 or 5 or 7 or 9, that's very valuable and very pleasing to collectors. But if there's only one of a set of 3 or 5, it's much less of interest. And God forbid that set go to auction and the auction house breaks one of them, which has happened. That can create problems, as you can imagine. That is so wonderful about stamps that you can't break them easily. I know some people must have very potent stories about losing their stamps. I think I read that somewhere. Didn't some collector have his stamp stolen or lost them or whatever?
Oh gosh, there's anecdote after anecdote about things like that. We have stolen collections, we have stolen stamps of different values, lost. You run down the list. We actually had a block of stamps that were stolen at a show in 1955 that of inverted Jenny stamps. There was a block of 4, and we've slowly recovered them since then. They were a gift. The claim to them was a gift from the original owner of those stamps, Ethel McCoy, and so we have one left to find, and that's the one. That's the one out of the 100 inverted Jennies that no one knows where it's located today.
Well, that would be a fine, but I wonder if it's duplicated. I mean, do you think there's a dealer that has duplicated the inverted Jenny and would like to sell it, or no?
Well, there have been attempts, but I mean, the beauty of stamps is that you have expert capabilities of identifying the stamps, even with the inverted Jennies that were stolen in our case. The stamps had been taken apart, so they were a block of 4, but they were still pulled apart, reperforated. The numbers were erased off the back so that naked eye detection didn't allow you to recognize whether they were genuine or not. But once those stamps were plated, you were able to, in fact, identify them as what position on the sheet they had been, and who they belonged to. That's how we identified the last one in 2016. We had 2 experts actually look at it and plate it both electronically and physically, and identified it as position 76, which was one of the missing stamps.
So stamp collectors have to be detectives, and how fun, really.
Yeah, there's a degree of that because when you're dealing with forgeries, there's a number of security measures you have to circumvent and bypass. But if you tear them apart one by one, you can identify them. And some of the most fun stories in the history of collecting revolve around people who've identified ways of how stamps have been counterfeited over the years and how the fakes and forgeries have been done, and being able to share that knowledge with the public so that they can avoid purchasing those fakes and forgeries themselves.
Right. How many stamp collectors do you think go through high-end dealers just to hopefully make sure they don't buy a fake or a forgery? The reason I ask is there are art collectors who do that. And it's obviously an expensive proposition because the person who's trusted will add a premium for doing it. I'm just curious, or do stamp collectors mostly select their stamps themselves?
It's often based on experience. If you're spending a lot of money on your collection, you're often going to deal with dealers that you've trusted, that you're aware of their expertise in a certain area, and that you'll go back to them again and again. For collectors that don't know who they're going through, or they're buying a stamp through an unfamiliar source, they'll come to a service like we offer and have it expertized so that they can identify whether it's a fake or a genuine. So we have experts that can validate the purchase or tell them they've purchased a fake or what have you.
And does the organization do that free, or is there some kind of charge?
We offer the service to members and non-members. For members, obviously, it's a much cheaper rate than if you were a non-member of the APS.
Right.
So I've got a couple more questions for you, and then I'm going to cut it off. So I've got five more in the queue. If you don't mind bearing with me, I really appreciate your patience here. I'd like to be able to get to these questions, and then we can wrap this up. With love for the chase, is there an addictive component to be sated from a find and then needing a new target? Is sunk cost what gamblers experience when they chase their losses? I like that question.
Okay, well, it seems to me there are two parts to it. One is anticipation of finding what you want is really stimulates the pleasure center. Anticipation just cannot be matched. But once you get it, your enthusiasm dies down. Now, the second part of that, so anyway, as a collector, as soon as you get what you want, in order to stimulate your pleasure center, again, you have to anticipate what you want and go for it again. So it is the thrill of the chase. It just repeats itself constantly. You can never get away from it. And some people, there are people on their deathbed that are still buying whatever they collect. I think. And what was the second part of that question, please?
It correlating it to gamblers and, uh, would you, would you compare that to, is sunk cost what gamblers experience when they chase their losses? That is, they've, say they're down $1,000 and they only decided to lose $1,000, but their goal is to then somehow win it back.
Right. That's very sad. I did write an article about this behavioral addiction, and I think that collecting can be a behavioral addiction where it isn't actually a biochemical abnormality, like somebody's need for cocaine or morphine like that, but it is in the brain that you need that stimulation, the anticipation again and again. So it's kind of a self-induced addiction. And I've talked with a few collectors who do get into trouble with their families about their collecting. So they spend money that the family really doesn't have or doesn't want for the involved collector to spend on this or that or the other thing. In fact, I think it's caused divorces. So that's a whole nother area.
That's a very deep topic. And again, I think we could find some common story anecdotes that go along with that.
Right. In fact, if any of the collectors that are listening tonight have any stories like that, I'd love to hear it. It's untapped as yet. It's a painful subject, so it's untapped.
Can you speak to the delight collectors get in showing other collectors their finds?
Oh my gosh, nothing could be better. It is, from my experience, so much fun. And especially when the other person knows something and can share some insights about the same area. It is one of the great pleasures of life. I guess there's a disappointment that comes too, not from showing the pieces, but that so few people are interested in what we collect. I would assume that stamp collectors must have the same issues as art collectors, porcelain collectors. I think art collectors like big art, big expensive paintings. I hope somebody notices them. But like porcelain, the neighbors aren't going to come in to see your porcelain. It's kind of a ho-hum. And the ones that do, sometimes I'm sorry they do because they know so little and they're just kind of taking my time unnecessarily. Must happen to stamp collectors too. Somebody who doesn't have a lot to do comes to see your collection.
That's the benefit of community, right? When you buy a stamp that you've been hunting for a while, but you have other individuals who have a like interest, you get to tell this exciting story of how you've been looking for the stamp and how you finally got it. When you speak to someone who has no frame of reference, it almost falls completely flat. I've seen it time and again with collectors trying to explain to non-collectors their thrill of the hunt. Uh, Although when I explain to non-collectors, when I talk to non-collectors about the hobby, I always say the most beautiful stamp you've ever seen is the one you just bought. And the ugliest stamp you've ever seen is the one someone else is trying to sell you. Because I think that really speaks to the behavior of a collector. That is, they value what they have in their hands and they own now, and they want to tell you how ugly the stamp is because they're in negotiating mode when they look at a stamp someone wants to sell you. So I think that's probably again across the board, probably some commonalities in other collecting interests as well.
Well, you hit on a behavioral economics tenet, which is that we always value what we have more than what someone else has. It's studied, written about. So, and you came to this conclusion, I think, just by observation.
Right. Next question is, why do collectors always regret a purchase that they did not make versus a purchase they did make? It's a great question.
It is because loss is registered more greater in our brains than the gain. Essentially, a loss means it is like 2 times devastating to us, where a gain is just like 1 time positive. So losses are always will sadden us much more than the gain will make us happy. It's human nature.
The next question is, can you speak more about how glucose affects the brain?
Oh my goodness, I'm afraid I'm not. Well, obviously we need glucose to live, but I'm afraid beyond that, I'm not confident in the study that studied glucose metabolism in porters. I just have to find the study and send it to someone, which I could try to do if this person is interested. It was
Well,
done elsewhere. It was done, I think, in China, and I did not put a lot of stock in it, as perhaps I could have, because it was done in a foreign country. And this is just thinking that maybe if it was done in the United States, it would be better. But perhaps not. I could be wrong.
the last question is, I used to think my goal was to have one of each of sets of stamps, but now I seem to want more and more examples of the same favorite sets. Is that common? Is that, how would you reflect on that?
That's interesting. More and more of the same favorite. So it's duplication.
Correct.
Right. That's very interesting. Uh, to my knowledge, people usually, if they have duplicates, they sell the poorer examples and keep the better examples and then add on in something different. So this is just, this is interesting. This is a person who is collecting what he or she knows and wants to repeat it because he or she is becoming expert in that area, I would suspect. And obviously that gives this person pleasure. So I don't know what to say beyond that.
That seems somewhat consistent with, it's consistent with the hobby. Once you move from accumulator to what I call a more specialized collector, duplicates are part of what you want. I have a vast collection of the same stamp over and again, because I'm studying the stamp, and so I want different examples and varieties of it.
Right. So you really can't, you'll never be fooled. You'll be an expert. You're the authority. Always nice to be an authority. One thing that we didn't address is deaccession, and that is something that there's so much about deaccession that hasn't been written about. It's, people say, okay, it's like cutting off an arm or leg. There's so much more to it. And it's something that at least porcelain collectors don't do enough of, so that, the relatives end up with the porcelain and don't know what to do with it. It's a very sad, it's sad, it's not happy. But
And
that's
and
part of
and
collecting at the end of life that is, you know,
and the family is never equipped to deal with the accession of that material in the same way that the collector was. And we deal with that time and again. We actually offer that service for loved ones who've inherited a collector's uh, material after he or she passed away, and we work with them to find someone who can help them move that material and deal with it in a proper way. Either make sure that it gets to individuals that were supposed to get an item or two, or making sure that it gets in the hands of the right dealers to sell or what have you.
Right. Good. Your organization sounds so wonderful.
Uh, I'm
I
gonna
wish.
cut I'm gonna cut that piece and I'm gonna use that over and over again.
All right.
This has been absolutely wonderful. I suspect we could probably do this for a lot longer, but I've really enjoyed the talk tonight, and I think the audience has as well. I really want to thank you for this. A reminder for anybody watching, if you missed any part of this, make sure you visit our YouTube page to watch the presentation and share it with your friends. Remember to like and subscribe to the APS YouTube page for our future stamp chats and other video content. If you're not a member of the APS, and I have no idea why you wouldn't be, please join today and join our stamp community. For more information, visit us at stamp.org. Dr. Mueller, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure. You've done a wonderful job, and I'd like to maybe have you come back and do a little deeper dive with stamp collectors again.
I appreciate the opportunity, and I'd like that, of course.
Great. Well, everyone, I hope you've enjoyed it, and thank you for joining us again. All the best. Bye now.
Bye-bye.